All right, welcome back. This is the Something Ventured podcast. I am Kent Lindstrom. I am your host. My guest today, Brad Feld. How are you doing?
I'm doing good, Kent. I'm glad it's a sunny day in Boulder, Colorado, and I'm glad to feel a lot of optimism in the air as we were chatting beforehand about sort of the human race trying to shift into a different gear. After a very long stretch of pandemic and isolation.
Yeah, we when last we talked, it was kind of now we know the middle of the pandemic, and everyone was locked down, and there was election uncertainty. People were in the streets for Black Lives Matter, obviously still important, but it's a different, more sanguine time, right? It seems like right now.
Yeah, well, I think I kind of remember actually last spring, right? We're at the end of May. While COVID was really raging a year ago, and people were really scrambling and struggling to figure out what to do, there was an emotional tone shift into the summertime. You know, people were able to be outdoors more, you know, the sun, the longer days, like even though there was enormous crisis in many different places, I do remember there being an emotional tone shift that feels similar with, you know, a difference that there is for many a sense of real relief, especially in the United States. I mean, there are obviously parts of the world that are in incredible distress right now, India being an example of that. But, you know, even in the backdrop of that, it's worth sort of acknowledging the immense level of stress that so many have even now. And, you know, some of it is a function of inequity. Some of it is a function of how COVID impacted their families or themselves or their businesses or their communities, like on, and how in many parts of even the US, there continues to be very significant stressors that are really ones that have been triggered from COVID. And I just sort of end with, I think for the foreseeable future, I don't know how long it's going to be, but for some period of time, we're going to have very profound echoes of the COVID crisis that instantiate as mental health issues across our society. It's not, you know, we're not wired to be light switch on, light switch off, right? Light switch off. Okay, you have to now live in your house 24 hours a day and you can't go out. Light switch on. Okay, everything's fine again. Like that's just kind of not how it works.
Yeah.
And yet many people need that or want that. And there are lots of people who are terrified of that and not yet ready for that kind of an engagement dynamic. And in a lot of cases, it's not necessarily a safe engagement dynamic. So it's this interesting moment where, in a lot of ways, it feels good that it's the summertime as we're in this liminal state.
Yep.
That has some transitional dynamics, because if we were in the dead of winter,
right,
and this was happening, like the vaccine rollout was finally happening in October, November, December.
Right.
I think it would be a lot harder in many ways to sort of navigate the emotional shift that we're all struggling with right now.
Yeah, I'm surprised by how kind of light switchy it is, in the sense that, you know, like 2 weeks ago, we were eating outdoors. A week ago, no more masks outdoors. 2 days ago, dining indoor. Like it feels like it's moving through these phases in a really, you know, quick way. And in a very kind of undistributed way, though, because like in San Francisco, you know, we're the lockdown, like we're the, you know, the lockdown experts here. And now that you don't have to wear a mask outdoors and everyone here is vaccinated, like that's, there's still a bunch of people just wearing masks outdoors, like howling wind, you know, sunny, 20 feet apart and wearing a mask walking down the street, you know, after the CDC said they don't do anything. You're like, oh, that's like, what is that?
Oh, it's a fun thing to sort of start with and unplug a little, because I think, you know, the fascinating thing to me as I've reflected on my own experience of the last 15 months, but also I'm 55, sort of reflected on, the last 35 years of my adult life. As humans, we are not a singular archetype. There's so many different types of people and on so many different dimensions. So it's we want to categorize things. We want to organize things. Like that's kind of a natural part of our species. So are you an introvert? Are you an extrovert? But it's not quite that simple. It's not this binary thing. Are you, I'll give an example of the mask wearing social dynamic that causes people to be happy to keep wearing masks, even if they don't have to, now that it's part of a social norm. There are a lot of people who don't necessarily want to be visibly exposed in public. And you see this in other cultures, in other countries where people already wore masks. They didn't wear masks necessarily for health reasons. It was more for privacy reasons. As they're walking down the street, they don't really want to engage with other people. They don't want to be they want to signal that they're not available for an interaction. Right. And so, I use that as one. I could give 10 other reasons why somebody might be wearing a mask after the CDC says masks are not necessary outdoors. And then one of it is, again, this on-off type dynamic. Every day I'm getting more emails. So sort of the net new number each day is increasing, sometimes by one or two, but it's increasing over the previous day, of people reaching out to me saying, can we get together? I'm vaccinated, we'd love to get together for dinner. We'd love to get together to hang out. We'd love to go for a walk. I'm actually where I am in terms of my own experiences. I'm not interested in that. I'm not ready for that. Intellectually and rationally, I know that it is safe. But it's not something I'm interested in this moment after 15 months of isolation, or almost 15 months of isolation. I'm doing taking a long sabbatical, a 5-week sabbatical this summer. And I have decided that I'm not going to do anything in person until after I get back. And there's a few exceptions. I'm not imposing this on my wife, Amy. So a friend comes over, right, and they spend time together, and that's totally fine. And I say hello. I mean, I don't like lock myself in a closet and not come out.
Right.
I am on a very selective basis doing a couple of things with friends who I really want to see for a specific reason. An example would be Dave Jilk, who's the co-author of this new book that we're going to talk about. The book is coming out Tuesday. Dave and I are going for a long hike tomorrow. It's one of his favorite things in the world to do is go for a hike. I am the sabbatical. Part of what I'm doing is I'm running the Colorado Trail, which is about 500 miles. So I'm doing a lot of hiking and running and serious vertical activity. So there's a very specific reason to celebrate this project that we've worked hard on, mostly virtually.
Yep.
And, to weave into it some of the sort of pre-exercise or pre-workout stuff that I'm doing on some pretty steep verticals with a thing that Dave loves to do.
Yeah.
I sort of say that long-winded.
Yeah.
I'll sort of end with a more specific thing. I think it's really useful for everybody to allow their own expression and their own dynamic in this moment to happen, but to be conscious or even just cognizant of so many different archetypes of people, and that many people have a very, very different set of things that are driving their own behaviors in this moment. And in that, letting it be okay for people who really want to get together. By the way, my view is, hey, totally cool. I don't have an emotional response, which is, it doesn't feel right to me.
Right.
And the flip side of it for somebody who really wants to get together, when somebody wants to stay isolated still or wear a mask, it's like, don't be deplored. I don't have the right word. Don't denigrate them. Don't say, there's no good reason. It's like, well, okay, that's their own processing of what this an unbelievable and an extraordinarily stressful thing that has just happened and still isn't over, but it is in a different state.
Yeah, I want to learn a little bit about your partner in this book, Dave, too, in a second. But I'm curious first. You've had the thesis for a long time that people can work. We don't all have to be in within 100 yards of the Battery in San Francisco, and people can start companies in Boulder and Singapore and all over the world. And a number of our portfolio companies that we've invested in, who we've never met in person, are in places like Miami and London, and their employees are all over the place. How do you think that's impacted your thesis? Has it proved you right, wrong?
Well, I think it's been huge evidence of the thesis. The thesis that I think you're really referring to was this notion when I wrote the first book on startup communities. It came out in 2012. I wrote it from 2010 to 2012. And at the time, there was still a cliche, which is if you're serious about starting a company, you should go to the Bay Area. Like literally, that was the conversation. The Bay Area, if you're not, sure, go ahead, start a company somewhere else. But if you're not serious, you're not serious. If you're serious, you would come to the Bay Area. And I think that cliche has been obliterated. The Bay Area is an amazing place, an amazing entrepreneurial place, and it will continue to be an amazing entrepreneurial place. But my thesis was the notion that you should be able to start an amazing company anywhere in the world. And the underlying behavioral dynamic was the notion of the democratization of entrepreneurship, that entrepreneurship was a global phenomenon. It was not a US phenomenon or a Bay Area phenomenon. And as a global phenomenon, the more energy locally and in different parts of the world people put into building their own startup communities that were entrepreneur-led, over a long period of time, you would end up with these very profound, robust, significant startup communities and entrepreneurial ecosystems everywhere in the world. One of the things that's been fascinating, and you just said it, 3 years ago, do you think you would have ever said, and many of our investments all around the world, where we haven't ever met the entrepreneur?
It's crazy.
Right? It's crazy.
I'd be fired from the venture capital club, probably.
That's right. In March of 2020, when COVID really started to spread across the US, prior to March 2020, a VC mantra was, we only will invest if we meet the founders. And there were endless expeditions of founders to venture capital firms in New York, in Boston, in the Bay Area. The number of people who had to get on a plane and fly to go to have a meeting on Sand Hill Road was endless. And the idea that a VC, some VCs would fly to the entrepreneur, but the idea that the VC would engage in a serious way without ever physically spending time with the entrepreneur was ludicrous. Several of my very successful investments are ones that I made before I met the entrepreneurs in person. A great example is Fitbit.
Oh, wow.
I invested in Fitbit, and I didn't meet the founders, James and Eric, until about 6 months after our investment closed. I went out to the Bay Area. We had a board meeting in person, but I had never met them in person. I'd done video with them. We talked a lot. We'd done lots of email back and forth, obviously, but I didn't feel that need to have that, whatever we want to call it.
Right.
Today, in March, there was some conversation amongst people, I won't say who they were, but there was some speculation that the entire investment activity would come to a grinding halt. And there were a lot of entrepreneurs who were very quizzical about this. They were not, I don't think scared, but they, and even in our portfolio, be like, how are we going to get our next round raised if we can't go meet the VCs? And by April, within 30 days, behavior had changed. And within 2 months, VCs were now talking proudly about the investments they were making through Zoom and virtually, and as though that was an amazing new thing that they could do, where they could make an investment without meeting the entrepreneur, which is, by the way, pretty awesome for entrepreneurship in general. And then by Q3, you started to see all of these financings start happening by VCs in other geographies. That they'd never invested in before, or maybe they'd made an investment 7 years ago in the geography. And so the velocity of that investing activity in these other geographies accelerated and started moving earlier. So there's always the case that, later stage investing was pretty geographically agnostic. If your company is growing 100% year over year and you're 50 million going to 100, it doesn't matter where you are. But if you're a, early stage company with a product in the market and you're doing $1 million in revenue, like getting that investor who's not near you or doesn't have regular activity in your market was hard. And then all of a sudden, that started shifting earlier and earlier. And now in May of 2021, at the early stages, you invest all over the world in entrepreneurs who you've never met with in person.
Yeah.
That is a foundational shift in the way entrepreneurship works. And it's one that I think is extraordinarily powerful. It is, is it validating of my thesis? Sure.
Right.
But I think it's really beneficial to the next 20 years of entrepreneurship globally, because we're really in a new phase. We're in a phase where, you don't have to go to the top of the mountain, as a supplicant to ask for money as an entrepreneur anymore. And as a result of that shift, which has been happening over the last decade, but all of a sudden it snaps into place and it's like, yep, it's different now. Let's talk about how it's different and let's build these businesses in different ways.
Yeah. We have a kind of funny thesis. It's that now we don't have to leave Silicon Valley, which is there was this idea people go to Miami, they go to Austin, like, oh, I'm going to be in Miami because it doesn't matter where you are anymore. And we're like, yeah, it doesn't matter where you are anymore. We can invest in Miami too. Like we don't have to be in Miami to invest in Miami. And we did. We invested in a guy who's got a company, in Miami.
I think this is a very amusing artifact of the moment. And I think it'll be an artifact, by the way, that vanishes pretty quickly. The artifact of the moment is a number of high profile and in many cases, very wealthy investors, and then a couple of entrepreneurs have chosen to move out of the Bay Area. And they've chosen to move out of California. And you can, talk about why they've chosen to move out of California. There's lots of richness in that. And not surprisingly, they've moved to states that now everybody's pointing and saying, wow, that's the next great place, because look, that super successful, super wealthy person just moved to that place. And, separate the reality of what's happening from the media and the self-promotion. The reality of what's happening is in the United States, you can live anywhere you want. You don't have to get a visa. You don't have to get citizenship to move from one state to another state. That's one of the powers of the US, the mobility across geography. It's one of the things that keeps states, by the way, competitive with each other, is that mobility. And historically, that mobility was used as an economic weapon through trying to recruit headquarters, right? We're old enough. We remember when, Boeing moved their headquarters to Chicago, and like that's a huge deal. Oh my God, Seattle's going to fall apart, and now Chicago, and like that's a part of economic development within state government. One of the dynamics in different geographies is standard of living and quality of life. One of the difference in geographies is weather. One of the difference in geographies is culture. One of the differences is not just in culture, but in the socioeconomic diversity of the cities. And you can keep going. There's 50, 100 characteristics of the cities. One of those characteristics is state income tax. And prior to the Trump tax cuts, your state income tax was deductible.
Right.
So if you paid a bunch of state income tax, it was deductible against your federal income tax. So it wasn't a wash. It was still a meaningful income tax, but you at least got a benefit against your federal taxes. The Trump taxes eliminated that. So now you had lower taxes theoretically, but your state taxes were now compounding because they weren't deductible from your federal income tax. That created a massive financial disadvantage for certain states. Some people sort of would straddle the line. They live in Connecticut, they work in New York, they live in Tahoe, they work in the Bay Area. Like they kind of, hope that they can get away with whatever those living, working rules are without having to behave like a professional athlete. And actually, you're supposed to report the number of nights you spent in a different city and pay taxes in different places. People sort of don't adhere to that. But all of a sudden, well, I can live anywhere I want. I can work anywhere I want. One of the benefits of moving to a different place is tax. So you have that phenomena. And again, I call it an artifact of the moment. I'm not saying tax is the only one, but there's a bunch of those artifacts where all of a sudden people are talking about it. And your point, Kent, is so powerful. Yeah. So if I love being in the Bay Area, I love living here. This is the place I want to be, and I want to invest everywhere. And it's a pain in the ass to schlep to New York City. It's a pain in the ass to schlep from San Francisco to Boston.
Right.
But I have network in New York City. I have network in Boston. I'm an early stage investor. My network already exists because I've done that schlepping.
Right.
I can make those investments much more quickly because I can now engage with people through video and through those networks without the geographic boundaries. Boom, that all changed. Yeah. And so I think your insight is powerful. My belief, my premise. I mean, I've lived in Boulder since 1995. I moved here with my wife Amy from Boston, and I grew up in Dallas, Texas. People say, "Why did you move to Boulder?" I moved to Boulder because my wife Amy, who's from Alaska, said, "I'm moving to Boulder. You can come with me if you'd like."
Right.
That's literally how we moved to Boulder. And Boston was very good to us, but it wasn't home.
Yeah.
And so I think that is now something that over the next 5 to 10 years in the United States will become a natural part of the entrepreneurial motion, which is that people will go where they want to live and build their companies there versus feel like they have to go to a particular place.
Yep. Because
that's where the entrepreneurial activity is.
Yeah. It's an amazing, amazing transformation. But you've done it again. You've written another book called Entrepreneurs Weekly Nietzsche, a book for disruptors, with your partner, David Jilk. So who is Dave? You guys come together, like, have you written with someone else before, or is this the first?
Yeah, no, I've done a bunch of books with co-authors. I did a book with my wife, Amy Batchelor, called Startup Life. The most recent book, The Startup Community Way, was with Ian Hathaway. I've done a few books by myself, but I'd say more of the books that I've written have been with co-authors. Dave and I have known each other 38 years. I met him on my first day of college. We became best friends in college. He's a couple of years older than me. So he was a senior. I was a freshman. We lived in the same fraternity house.
By the way, I didn't realize that there was a Greek system at MIT.
There is. And it has evolved. When I was at MIT in the 1980s, there was an enormous housing problem on campus. Mm-hmm. And the housing problem was there just wasn't enough housing. There were not enough dorms. Yeah. And I don't remember why. Like MIT certainly had the money and the land to build more dorms, but they didn't do it. And as a result, there was a vibrant fraternity system. I don't remember the number of separate chapters, but let's say it was 20. Yeah. And it was to house probably about 1,000 people that otherwise didn't fit within the existing dorm system. Interestingly, with again, a historical thing, and I say interestingly as a euphemism, there was no sorority system. And part of the reason there was no sorority system at MIT was that the male-female ratio in the 80s was 80-20. Today, MIT has worked very, very hard to get that to roughly 50-50, and I think they've done a very good job of that. But when I was an undergrad, it was 80-20, and there was enough housing, either co-ed dorms or female-only dorms, for women, although that was not necessarily a rational reason for there not to be a sorority system. And then another step of that, some people may know a few people sort of in the mix here. There was the house that I lived in was a fraternity called ADP. It's on Mass Ave at the corner of Mass Ave and Main Street. We shared a building. So it was a 5-story building, but there were 2 separate buildings that were attached with a central corridor. And 353 or 355 Mass Ave, I think it was 353 Mass Ave, was something called Women's Independent Living Group. And so it was an independent living group, not a sorority, but just for women. And there were a few of my contemporaries lived in that building, and that was pretty fun.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, we had
an example. Just an example for people. Name people may know is Megan Smith, who was at Google for many, many years, and was in the Obama administration. And I believe she was the first maybe CTO or CIO or whatever her role was in the Obama administration was a first.
Yeah. Oh,
role.
incredible. So you and Dave, so over the years, you both start companies, but you become a venture capitalist, and he kind of stays a serial entrepreneur over time. And he ends up in Boulder too?
Yeah. So Dave and I started a company together while I was still in school. He had graduated. I like to say that was my first company. It's actually the third company I started. He and I started a company with two other people when we were undergrads, a company called Martingale Software with a guy named Andy Mina and another person who may be well known to some of your audience, Samir Gandhi, who's at Excel. And we all lived together. We built, it's interesting, it was when the Mac came out, and prior to the Mac actually launching, we got a Lisa computer, and we were trying to write software for the Mac. And our idea was to create a piece of software where you entered in numbers and you could then display graphs and sort of modify the type of graph you had based on what you wanted. Obviously, Excel became that thing. That company failed. But Dave and I went on to start another business that we ran together for about 7 years and then sold it to a public company. And after that, he left pretty quickly. I stuck around for a year and a half. Although during that period of time, I started making angel investments with the money that I made from that first sale. And I made about 40 angel investments between 1994 and 96. And Dave moved to Savannah, Georgia. I ended up moving to Boulder, Colorado. And he ended up joining or starting a number of companies over time. And there was a point in time for him where he decided that he wanted to leave Savannah. And he left Savannah and, kind of came to Boulder, I think a little bit whimsically. Like he was spending time in the Bay Area, flying back and forth, and I was in Boulder, and he's like, yeah, what the hell? And interestingly, he fell in love with Boulder right away. And part of it was something that I think his younger self didn't know, but he loved the mountains.
Mm-hmm.
And he loved hiking in the mountains and climbing in the mountains and camping in the mountains and being in the mountains. Just loved it. And there's a link to Nietzsche here, which is that Nietzsche spent summers in a part of the world where he would constantly go on very, very long walks. And these were really hikes, right? But long walks where he would just think. And when I think about Dave and how Dave has sort of grown as a human from when we were, in our early 20s to today, like that is a pretty profound part of his own experience, which is wandering around in the mountains, letting his brain go where it wants. And interestingly, it is for me as well. And I couldn't have told you in my early 20s, I could have told you I loved running, but I couldn't have told you that I loved to just be lost for 3 or 4 hours in the mountains by myself without anybody else, letting my brain do whatever it wants to do. And so that's been a common love of both of ours for a number of years.
So as a book guiding entrepreneurs, how does Nietzsche get in the mix here?
So Dave semi-retired a number of years ago, and he kind of does a couple of things. He owns a company that he spends some time with. He writes, he does AI research and writes papers, but not affiliated with any institution. He conquers all the outdoor spaces in Colorado on a regular basis. And he goes through different intellectual phases. He writes poetry, again, something neither of our younger selves would ever have believed. And he's quite a good poet. If people are interested, he's got a couple of books on Amazon that he's written that you can find if you look for Dave Jilk. And he got very interested in philosophy maybe a decade ago and started reading depth-wise many different philosophers. My wife, Amy, has a political philosophy degree. So she also has read all the classics and read a number of classical philosophers and read a number of contemporary philosophers. And I would say, I have sound bites from all of them.
Yeah.
That's my level of depth of classical philosophy. And so Dave and his wife, Maureen, and Amy and I regularly would spend time together at our mountain house on the weekend, 3-day, 4-day weekend type experiences. I'd work on Thursday, Friday, and we'd hang out over the weekend, but we'd all sort of be together. And one of the things, obviously, Dave and Maureen would go for long hikes. as they would want to do. But then we'd often find ourselves sort of laying around on our couches reading. That was a big part of the weekend experience for us. And Dave remembers when Nietzsche first came into it, which is he'd gone deep on Nietzsche. He'd started to read, and when I say gone deep, he's not reading just Nietzsche, but he's reading what other people have written about Nietzsche.
Right, like the book on Nietzsche.
Correct. And sort of exploring all of it. So, it's his own education, but he's doing it self-guided versus like, I'm going to go on Coursera and take a Nietzsche course. It's like, I'm going to just immerse myself in it. And I don't have any idea what I was reading. But one of the rhythms of our reading, which parallels Amy and I, who lay on our couch and read a lot together, is Amy will say something to me while I'm reading and I will respond to her, but continue reading. In other words, it's not a I stop. It's like, I can respond, but then I keep going. And Dave had said something to me and said, hey, does this quote sound like entrepreneurship to you? And he read some quotes to me. And my response was, he like say my response was, yep.
Right.
But he like took a note. And as sort of, this was about 2013, over the next year or two, as he kind of continued to go very deep on Nietzsche, he kept peppering me with quotes, and we kept sort of saying, yeah, these really apply to entrepreneurship. And I think probably by about 2015, the idea of writing a book that linked Nietzsche to entrepreneurship philosophically came about. The other inspiration for it, which is really important to mention, is Ryan Holiday and all the writing he's done on Stoicism. I'm an enormous fan of Ryan's work, and I think he has done a huge benefit to entrepreneurs, and in general, it's not just aimed at entrepreneurs, but to leaders, with all of the work he's done bringing Stoic philosophy to the fore. Right. And this is hard to do. Like if you go read, Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, it's hard. It's not a lot of pages, but it's hard.
Yep.
If you read Ryan Holiday, it's not hard. And then when you go and read Meditations after you've read, one of Ryan's books, it's still hard to read. You have to work at it, but it's a lot less hard.
Yep.
Because you somehow have some cognitive links now to what you're reading and why you're reading it. And we were pretty motivated to do the same thing for Nietzsche, because reading Nietzsche in the original is hard.
Mm-hmm. And why would it be the case? I mean, there are other cases. There was the, Sun Tzu Art of War as it applies to business. You watch any Shakespeare play now and you're like, yep, that's how it works. Like that's how people work still. Why would Nietzsche resonate down the years to entrepreneurship today?
So Nietzsche is a fascinating philosopher in many ways. One of them is he's a bridge between classical and contemporary thought, not just philosophy. And there's this very interesting, we have a chart near the end of the book, and I'll just look at it and I'll read off some names. If I can find it quickly, I should probably bookmark it. Yeah, here it is. So, if you think about all of the different sort of transitional people, we have categories: composers, poets, scientists, foils, spiritual figures, philosophers, thinker, writers, composers, poets, psychologists, artists, existentialists, all who are influenced by Nietzsche, or who Nietzsche was a connector between. And, there's about 50 names. I'll leave them as surprises for people. But 50 names where Nietzsche really had a significant influence on that thinker, or made a bridge between that thinker and contemporary thinking. And he did it because Nietzsche's philosophy is not do this, do that. He is not a philosopher who says, here is the problem, this is the answer. And much of classical philosophy has that, and sort of, Thomas Merton's Man's Search for Meaning, the ideas around that sort of thing, where it's like philosophy is this essence to try to say what's going on within this species of our own, and trying to, again, make some meaning out of it. So much of that meaning prior to Nietzsche was in the context of religion. And religion was how that meaning emerged. And sort of at the tail end of classical philosophy, you had this phenomena where people were starting to now be outside the guise of religion, but still contained within that. That's how we sort of ascribed overall meaning. And if you think even of sort of scientists like Galileo and, the amazingness of Galileo, but then the incredible challenge he had, at the latter part of his life because of the church and how he basically had a choice. He could be killed or he could say to the church, I renounce this, and then was allowed to live, but sort of in a very isolated way. I mean, very challenging dynamics. Nietzsche was the crossover point. And some of it was the time, right? The 1870s, 1880s, that time period. But a lot of it was his ability to not say, this is true, this is false, but instead put out something that's provocative and then keep worrying it, keep working through it, keep challenging it. And I think that's why it's so powerful for entrepreneurs. There are now, when I started writing my blog in 1994, there wasn't that much content on the web that said, entrepreneurs, you should do this, you should do that. There was a little bit, but there wasn't a lot. And, some of the early bloggers, Dave Hornick, Fred Wilson, me, a couple of others, I think we did spend time with, trying to explain how certain things worked, but we also were exploring our ideas and playing around with ideas in public. And that was, I think, the thing that was really attractive about, I won't use my blog, I'll use Fred's blog, so it's not as self-referential. If you go back and read Fred's blog over time, the awesomeness of it is he's thinking out loud.
Right.
He hasn't figured out the answer, but he's trying some stuff out. And he's okay being wrong. He's okay being challenged. He wants the discussion. Today, I don't know how many gigabytes of VCs have written things about this is what you should do, and here's how you should run your B2B SaaS business, and here's how you should raise your next financing, and this is what you should do in terms of building your leadership team. And there's endless writing about that. Much of it quite good, a lot of it contradictory, and much of it, frankly, not that helpful if you're an entrepreneur who is trying to figure out one's own answer. You're on your own journey. And as a leader, you're thinking about stuff, and the leader doesn't say, please tell me the answer so I can go do that. Instead, she says, I'm very interested in collecting data. I want some stories. I want your experiences, but I need to synthesize those. And I want them to make me think about what's going on in the context of this thing I'm disrupting. And I want to come up with my own way to disrupt it. I don't want, I'm not looking for a job. I'm creating a new thing. And so for us, at some point, Nietzsche clicked into view as that philosopher who was accessible, that did that in our minds as well or better than anyone else, tied to this notion of so many of the things he say, in the same way that Stoicism has such broad application to leadership. So much of what Nietzsche is saying is about creativity and about, the creation of new, and about people who are not like everybody else, and people who are not easily understood, and people who have great strengths, but also great weaknesses. And sort of, does that sound like entrepreneurs to you? Sounds like entrepreneurs to me.
Yep. And how, as this book evolves, why is it the Entrepreneur's Weekly Nietzsche?
Yeah, so this comes back to Ryan. Ryan wrote a book, Holiday, wrote a book. One of my favorites is called The Daily Stoic. And he's got a calendar of the day that's a Daily Stoic, but the book is much, much better. It's 365 chapters, 12 sections, one for each month. So each month has a theme. And each chapter is a quote by one of the Stoics, not the same, but Seneca shows up a lot and Marcus Aurelius shows up a lot, but plenty of others. And you read the quote, and the quotes are a sentence or two at most. And then Ryan has written mostly one page, sometimes maybe it's a little longer than a page, but generally a page that applies the quote to leadership. And so I like that idea. And so we started talking about it. And both Dave and I, when we thought about 365 quotes, Nietzsche quotes, and trying to deconstruct them, we both went, ugh. Like,
Right.
Number one, I'm not sure that we're going to find 365 that apply to entrepreneurship. And second, maybe we would. Second, like, that seems really hard.
Yeah.
And so somewhere along the way, I said, how about we do 52? We do one for each week. and that's how the weekly came up. And it turned out to be a better approach because instead of one page, we've written kind of 500 to 1,000 word essays. So they take 1 to 5 pages. So they're a little richer. The essays are a little longer. And then for about half of them, we have a narrative. And the narrative is from an entrepreneur. And here, we did not pick famous, well-known Bay Area entrepreneurs. There's a few here and there, people that you'd recognize the names. But a lot of the entrepreneurs, many of whom have had real success, are not super well-known. And this is important because we wanted this to feel very accessible versus, this is the super successful elites from on high telling us what the answer is. No, these are entrepreneurs just like everyone else who's an entrepreneur, who have had their ups and downs, but who are interpreting the Nietzsche quote their own way with their own stories. And so the narratives themselves, and there's about 25 of them, they're much more lightly edited. We let them be more like blog posts for people. We didn't try to get them just right, and we didn't try to get them to like make a point. And some of the better ones actually are contradicting pieces of what we've said in our narrative. Because if you cycle all the way back, the goal is to get somebody who reads the book, who's an entrepreneur, to think, not to follow directions.
Yep.
To think. The last thing that's neat about it being weekly is having now read a few books by Nietzsche in the entirety, and having read a lot about Nietzsche, and having read lots of little pieces of things, it is hard. It takes time to read a Nietzsche book. You don't lay down on a couch on a Saturday and finish on a Sunday. And so there's something, you can read this book start to finish if you want. You can also just sort of take it, a week at a time. Yep. And read a thing and just sort of think about it and let it roll around, and then come back at the end of the week or middle of the week and read it again because it's short, and sort of let it roll around in your brain in a way that different connections as you're having your experience unfold. That's what we wanted to do with this one.
It's really interesting because a lot of business books, by famous people, I get through them like, standing in the bookstore at the airport. You flip, you kind of get the idea. And this, Dave posts some of them. I haven't read the book, but posts some of them. And it's true. You read them and you kind of go, I don't have this yet. This is going to take me a little bit of time. So it's sort of the opposite of a business book that you flip. You go, okay, I get it. You're sort of like, I'm going to have to do some work to get this. Like, I kind of get it, but I don't completely get it. So I'm going to live with it, sit with it. And I got that just from his, couple quotes on his Twitter feed.
You totally got it, Kent. I mean, that's the magic. And I like what you say about business books. I have a slightly different line about most business books, and I read a lot. I have I read a lot of business books. I have many friends who've written business books, some that I've encouraged and helped with, and I'm pretty happy to write forwards for my friends when they do all the work of writing a book, and view that as a way to appreciate them and their books. The business book is not my favorite book format. I read a huge amount of science fiction. Yep. I also like contemporary fiction, and I like biography. I've read some history over the years, but I like science fiction more than I like history. In some ways, science fiction is also just history because it's all reflective of each other, like you said earlier. Like you read Shakespeare, and that's
that's how it works.
Point to where that's playing out. And so, but one of the interesting challenges with most business books for me is most business books can be 20 pages long, not 200. And having now published, this being book number 8, and understanding how books work and the traditional publishing industry works, and having sort of tried a few things outside the norm of the traditional publishing industry and had some things fail. And with this book, this is a book that we published using partnering with an organization called Scribe, So it's sort of in between a self-published book where you just do all the work yourself and a book where you have an imprint where, their job is just to help you publish the book and produce the book. It's not a traditional publishing model. And it's been an awesome experience to work with Scribe. I've had a number of friends also work with them recently, and I'm really impressed with every aspect of the experience. In that, when you go through, doing these books, you realize that the reason the book has to be 200 pages long and not 20 is because that's the essence of how the publishing model works.
Right.
And there's a great example of this done right, which is Jim Collins is an extraordinary writer, and his books are worth reading every page of. One of his books early on, I think the one that made him famous, was a book called Good to Great. It's probably written 20 something years ago, 30 years ago. And it's an extraordinary book, and still is an extraordinary book. In the book Good to Great is one of the most important concepts I've ever encountered as an entrepreneur and an investor, which is the flywheel. And he has it in the book. It's one of the pieces of the book, not the only part of the book, but it's probably the one that the tech community has adopted the most. And there's some if you search on the internet for, Amazon flywheel, you'll get Jim Collins stuff, and you'll see how Amazon adopted the flywheel, or Netflix flywheel. You'll see how they adopted the flywheel. So powerful. He came out a few years ago with a book called The Flywheel, and it's a monograph.
Oh, yeah.
It's 40 pages, maybe even less long, and it's just about the flywheel. And it is, I send it to every CEO I work with. It's one of my favorite sort of easy giveaways to a new person that I'm working with, or somebody that's struggling with, what do I do to get my business momentum going? It's something that's used in a number of our companies that we're investors in as a core part of their strategy. AvidXchange, which I'm on the board of, uses it. Techstars uses it as sort of an internal way to think about what they're trying to create. And I just say that, with this book, we didn't try to create a book that you have to read every page of. You can go to the table of contents, and the table of contents, we've broken it up into 5 areas. And, you can look at the strategy area, and there's a chapter called Hitting Bottom. You can go to the culture area, and there's one called Monsters, which is kind of interesting and easy to relate to if you're in low stress. There's one called Groupthink, right? Or Gratitude. Yep. You can go to Free Spirits, and there's one called Work as Reward, Maturity as Play, Shadow of Success. At any moment you could look at it and say, Tactics, we have a section called Strong Beliefs. And, it's kind of interesting. If you're part of the Strong Beliefs Weekly Held mantra, or you're opposed to Strong Beliefs Weekly Held mantra, there's good debate on both sides. Here in this 3 or 4 pages, we're giving you something to chew on, to think about in this moment where that may be the thing that's important to you, versus here's a framework, here's what you got to do to implement the framework.
Well, let me finish with this. What type of an entrepreneur at what stage should come to your book, Entrepreneurs Weekly Nietzsche, and sort of how should they approach it? I
think everyone should. When I write a book, I try to approach every book I've ever written with beginner's mind. Even Venture Deals, which is a book that when Jason Mendelsohn and I wrote it, it demystified the term sheet, and you could say, well, what's the big deal about that? But in 2010 or 11, whenever it came out, there was enormous opacity around how deals worked in the venture community. And today, if somebody is, starting to, become a lawyer, become a VC, interested in being an angel investor, or starting out as an entrepreneur, it's incredibly helpful. But even with that book, our hope was that people who were experienced would find value in the book. And one of the greatest compliments we got early on was from Craig Douchy at Cooley, who was a senior partner for many, many years at Cooley, had written a book on entrepreneurial law that was a very popular book and a very well done book. And he sent us a note that said, I just read the book. I won't get the note exactly right, but it was something like, I just read the book. This is really, really significant. This is going to help so many lawyers who struggle, even though they've done lots of deals and lots of venture investments, they struggle with understanding like what they should pay attention to and what they should care about and how they should approach it and what the motivations are. So with this one, same thing, we approached it with beginner's mind and said, all right, well, if I'm a first-time entrepreneur, obviously it's very helpful. If I'm an experienced multi-time entrepreneur, why would I care about this book? And Reid Hoffman wrote the foreword, and Reid's Reid's an amazing entrepreneur, a really remarkable person. I just every time I spend time with Reid, I always come out of it feeling just lucky that I know him and that he's willing to spend some time with me. In the friendship that we have. And it turns out, he cares deeply about philosophy.
Yep.
Early on, when we started working on this project, I knew that he cared about philosophy. I didn't know, and that he had studied philosophy. Yeah. I didn't know if he knew much about Nietzsche. I sent him a note and said, hey, I don't know if this is going to interest you or not, but, I'm working on this. And his response was effusive, right? Wow. That's awesome. I love Nietzsche. Yes, the world needs that. Nietzsche applies so much. Like, it's that kind of thing. Yeah. And when we asked him if he'd write the foreword before we'd really written much of the book, he said, yes, totally, I'm in. And so we sent him a draft of the book, reasonably far along, when we started to feel like the book was starting to converge on a book versus a piece of shit that we were trying to get into a book form. Right. And he read through it and he was really enthusiastic about it from the standpoint of not just, hey, cheerleading, but from the standpoint of how we had done what we had done and the things that it was making him think about. He then wrote a foreword that I've written a number of forewords, and I try really hard when I write a foreword. I ask the authors to sketch out for me in as much or as little as they want what they're doing. I always read the book before I write the foreword. I won't write a foreword for something I haven't read. But I want the author to give me his or her roadmap. And then I sit down and I rewrite it. And sometimes I rewrite it a lot. And sometimes I just change a little bit because there's not a lot to rewrite. But it varies a lot. And some of it has to do with how well the author knows me, because if they know me pretty well, they can write something that sounds more like in my voice versus, here's what they envision it would be. Reid didn't ask for that. Reid just sat down and wrote a foreword. And when he delivered the first draft of the foreword, Dave and I were blown away because not only did he capture the essence of it, but he wrote a lot of it or sort of bits and pieces of it in Nietzsche's style. Wow. So it's just phenomenal. So like when I use that as an example, like it would be easy for Reid as a very experienced, extraordinarily accomplished entrepreneur to kind of say, yeah, this is sort of interesting. But even for him, I believe it was provocative. It prompted him to think about things. It was stories from people he'd never heard of before, saying things in ways that resonated with maybe some experiences, maybe new experiences. And so again, on this spectrum for entrepreneurs, I'd say it applies to everyone, at least I hope it does. I'd also say it's in the category, everything I write is for people who are aspiring entrepreneurs, people who work in entrepreneurial companies and want to better understand the stresses of the entrepreneur, the challenges of the entrepreneur. It's easy, very easy for us as people, in the industry or outsiders or people in companies or people who have been in a company that failed or a company that has an entrepreneur who's difficult to deal with or who has a different personality than they have. It's easy to be critical of other people. Again, we'll come back to where we start. There's not a singular archetype of entrepreneur. Every human is complex. Yeah. We are all big bags of chemicals where the chemicals react in different ways. And we all have different lived experiences that have caused us to then have different perspectives and views on the world. And starting to have insight into those differences, good and bad, can be very helpful to anyone who is encountering and experiencing those relationships. And And that's part of what we try to do here.
Wow. So all entrepreneurs then should read Entrepreneur's Weekly Nietzsche, a book for disruptors. Thanks so much for doing this.
Kent, it's always really fun to do. We did this podcast with you last year, or we did together last year. It's really fun because I'll just say, not in a gratuitous way, the prompts are good ones, and then you let me roll with it.
Oh, wow.
But then the next prompt links to the last prompt. And a lot of times in a podcast interview, right, there isn't any continuity. It's just, a series of questions. But for me, I just sort of thinking, I listen to some of the podcasts that I do. There's a lot that I kind of get off and think I get done with. And I think, there's a lot of good content there, but I don't need to listen to it because I'm not sure I said something new. Yeah. It's not somewhere else. This one I did. So I will be for sure listening to the podcast again when it comes out. So thank you.
Well, I appreciate that. And let me say, the book is Brad Feld, and Dave Jilk wrote it with you as well. Entrepreneur's Weekly Nietzsche, a book for disruptors. I'll talk to you guys next time.